So I may depend more and more on what you have to offer. But in any way, today I want to specifically turn to Sloka 1 of stanza 7. This is page 213 in the original edition, and somewhere or other it is in the Dzyan edition, volume 1, something or other. Anyway, it's page 213, the original edition. It's the Sloka 1 of stanza 7. So it's somewhere or other in, 260 thereabouts in the Dzyan edition. Everybody found it? Page 260, is that right, Marion?
Yes, that's right.
260 if you have the Dzyan edition. And I propose, first of all, to read through the shloka, just to get us familiar with us. Behold the beginning of sentient, formless life. We've already commented a bit on this, but I'm going to comment further. First the divine, the one from the mother spirit, then the spiritual, the three from the one, the four from the one, and the five from which the three, the five, and the seven. These are the threefold and the fourfold downward, the mind-born sons of the first Lord, the shining seven. It is they who are thou, me, him, O Lanu, they who watch over thee and thy mother, Bhumi. Marvelous. And we're back, of course, to numbers. Well, let's keep in mind, first of all, that we're dealing not only then with highly abstruse concepts, as we have been involved in what may be called the slow upbuilding of a universe, or more properly, the emanation from that primal radiation, an emanation from a radiation. But also, very mystically, with ourselves, with our own being. Man as the model, the archetype, as well as the goal of the process. The cosmic pattern is very clearly then reflected in, mirrored in our own spiritual, psychophysical structure. Very definitely. This fact has already been expressed by H.P.B., particularly in her commentary on her exposition of stanza 6. She quotes Carlyle there, page 212, just the preceding page. The highest being reveals himself in man. This body, these faculties, this life of ours, is it not all as a vesture for the unnamed? Well, this fact is given, of course, further emphasis throughout the entire stanza 7, culminating in the final shloka, which we will get to eventually. This is thy present wheel. Thou art myself, my image and my shadow. I have clothed myself in thee, and thou art my Vahana Vahan, to the day be with us, when thou shalt re-become myself and others, thyself and me. A magnificent ending to the cosmogonic process. It's a tremendous and, I think, very awe-inspiring concept as we begin to realize that we are dealing with that great matrix of mystery, as Gunther calls his book, translates the text, which is the human stage, the man stage. Furthermore, life is present in everything and everywhere throughout the universe. We've said this, and I merely repeat it. There is no particle, no aspect of existence which is not found in us and which is not then devoid of life. From top to bottom, if you like, inside to outside, outside to in, the universe is a living being. So, in a sense, we have here in the first shloka a recapitulation of the cosmogonic process so far given us, but there's an added factor. And this we've noted again and again, that this is always the case when there is a recapitulation of a process. Incidentally, I'll come to this later, so don't worry about it. You may not be able to read it all at this point, but I thought I'd get it up there to begin with and save a little time later. So don't worry about it. Because what I'll do later is to try to correlate this with the Tibetan text that Günther has given us. The initial statement, you see, behold, I've already commented to some extent on this, behold the beginning of sentient, formless life, carries us back to the very beginning of the process, indeed. In fact, to the pre-process. We can say that the process is pre-programmed in that a mysterious, unnameable you can't say quality, you can't use essence, you can't say anything, but in that mysterious unnameable, there is a pre-program of the process, if you like. Shloka 8 of stanza 1, for example. Alone, the one form of existence, stretched boundless, infinite, causeless, in dreamless sleep. This is the pre-program. The one form, the one expression of existence of that which stands forth is now asleep. Life pulsated unconscious in universal space throughout that all-presence which is sensed by the opened eye of the Dhamma. I'm not going back to stanza 1 to pick that up. We didn't go into it in detail, but here it is, even in the ever-darkness, if you like, even during the great Mahapralaya, within the matrix of space, dormant within the cosmic womb, whatever phrase you want to use. No phrase completely captures the totality of it, does it? And yet all of these may help us. They are metaphors for that which is.
We can get something of an idea of the tenuous subjectivity of this plane. It is something, of course, which persists throughout Pralaya.
Yes.
But when you consider that we are operating on the lowest subplane of the lowest of 7 cosmic
planes, yes.
What is consciousness like on the top?
That's it. And what is consciousness?
The nature of this being.
What is consciousness like even at the top of the Prakritic plane?
Yes.
You see. Let alone on the top of the top plane, if you like. But life is present. It pulsates unconscious within that matrix. Formless yet, as I said, but still sentient. It is sentient because life and consciousness are inseparable. And it is formless because neither can it become objective to the senses, nor is it in itself the forms to which it gives rise and which it invests. So the life of the matrix, the great mother, if you like, is only unconscious in the sense that it does not know, not in the sense that it does not feel. It's a throbbing, sensitive life that infuses every focal center in existence, from atom to our own psychic being. So for the beginnings of sentient life, we have to return to the very origin, the source, which in itself has no origin, no beginning, no moment when it was not. The radiation of that, whether we call it space, the matrix, akasha, or great singularity, proceeds, as we've noted again and again, in an orderly, hierarchical manner. In this connection, it's interesting to note, I've already referred to him, some of the ideas developed by Ilya Prigogine. Didn't leave myself any space to put these on the board, did I? Except at the very bottom. But in deference to those who keep saying, put it on the board, I better use some other color. I haven't used any much green, so I'll put it down here. This is not then a part of this, but Prigogine, and the main work, I think I've already quoted from it, Order Out of Chaos. There are other works, but that's perhaps the easiest of his works to get at. He's Belgian, Order Out of Prigogine, and his colleagues in what is known as the Brussels School of Thought in science. The ideas which are presented have been, one person has said, they add up to a novel, comprehensive theory of change. Now, in respect to open systems, from the point of view of the esoteric, that is, those systems which exchange energy or matter with their environment, and in this view, of course, the matrix or akasha is indeed an open system, since everything is within that, and the matrix itself is in constant interchange with itself. This is, I think, often our problem, isn't it? We think of form as something not of that, but it is both life and form. The reality concerned, instead of being orderly, stable, and equilibrial, is seething and bubbling with change, disorder, and process. So that this is all the time moving towards disorder. But, and this is the significant point, and one of the key controversies surrounding this whole concept of the open system has to do with Prigogine's insistence that order and organization can actually arise spontaneously out of disorder and chaos through the process of self-organization. And this is, it's still a controversial theory, but Prigogine is very much respected in the field of science. We can't explore of course, Prigogine's concepts in detail, and a study of his book is utterly fascinating and goes along with Jansch's view of the self-organizing universe. You see that there is a spontaneous, a movement that is always, to use the term entropy, towards dissolution, towards disorganization, towards disequilibrium. And we live in a universe which is always moving in that direction. The leaves are coming off the trees today, this gale force. It's a disequilibrium that is present. But there is a renewal process even within that, and the disorder has to come. I don't like using chaos in that sense, because chaos really does not mean disorder, although we usually think of it in that term. We've already commented on this. But there's a process of self-organization.
Astral light.
Yes, of course. So it's presenting in scientific language this Prigogine, who's a Nobel Prize-winning chemist. His field originally was chemistry, but like many of our contemporary scientists who have a wider vision, they reach out beyond their own field and touch on other fields, the life sciences as well as the physical sciences. One finds that with people like Prigogine and Jansch, as well as Capra, Dr. Bohm, very much, David Bohm, and so on, and reach out. And suggest this, you see, that the process is one in which there is always a spontaneous self-organization, self-regeneration, self-transformation. This, I think, lies very close to the real meaning of the term, of course, svabhavat. It has its own self-becomingness. So the recapitulation, then, at the beginning of this takes us over the familiar territory of number, on which we've commented in previous sessions. We're reminded, of course, specifically here in Shloka 1 of the sequence given us in Shloka 3 of stanza 4 and the entire concept of the hierarchies. And now, happily, I don't have to comment very much on this because Adam has already given us the information. And so I think there's not much need to review it. But here we have, again, the hierarchy of creative forces in terms of number. And so it's not an easy one to grasp. I don't claim that that Adam's presentation has concluded the subject. I don't think he would think that, because it's a study which continues for a long time. And while we may attempt to understand the hierarchies, as it were, as the structural framework of being, we have to remember that in some mysterious way they are not only the form but also the life or energy of the process. Or rather, as life or energy, the hierarchies form themselves, exhibit themselves as form. But perhaps I can put it that way. It's just a slightly different way of saying it. But because they are the life energy of the system, they exhibit themselves in forms. It may be useful to recall a statement made in connection with stanza 4 when there we were introduced to the causal powers which organize energy into the hierarchy of being. I think I said, if I didn't, I meant to, that just as the unmanifest content of darkness can only become explicitly known when differentiated and spread out in space-time, so all cosmogonies have to treat the levels of the universe as if they were spatially separate, whereas in fact they are simultaneously present. We're at this moment, in other words, living in the creative process, and every level of being is in us and around us. And we are, in a sense, the summation which exhibits all levels of being. So Shloka 1 now gives us not only the numbers of the creative hierarchies, the reawakened energies of stanza 4, but also introduces us to these numbers as what HPB calls the hierarchy of creative powers, which she says in her commentary is divided into 7, or 4 and 3. And I think this is an interesting point. The 3 from the 1, the 4 from the 1, and the 5 from which the 3, the 5, and the 7. These are the threefold and the fourfold downward. So one does not, I think it's Jeffrey in one of the diagrams, wasn't it, showed that there is this.
Yeah. The 3 and the 4 I can sort out, but I can't relate the 3 and the 4 to what's in here. I get lost.
Well, remember that and she says within the 12 great orders. Remember then the numbers given us in stanza 4, the 1 from the egg, the 6 and the 5, then the 3, the 1, the 4, the 1, the 5, the sum total, there being called the divine man or heavenly man. Here we reach the same result. Here again we have the first, the 1 from the mother spirit, which is called the divine vehicle, and which can be equated, I think, with the limited space of creation marked out by the ray in the unlimited matrix. Because we don't know the totality. It's that portion that is, if we can put it, illumined by the ray, the radiation, that we are dealing with? Do we know whether that is the extent? In terms of ourselves, this is that point known as the Atman, which is, if I can put it this way, only a potential, as it is non-differentiated until vehicled in buddhi. I've made up another word. Vehicled in buddhi. Buddhi becomes its upadhi. It is vehicled there. Hence, next is the spiritual, or as HPB indicates within the shloka, Atma Buddhi, spirit soul. And so we have the primary triplicity, the primary pattern of a triplicity, the three from the one, the trinity of conscious modes which exteriorize in a quaternity, the four from the one, and give rise to the fivefold characteristics of the sensible universe. These characteristics, as we've already been told in stanza 5, born from the quaternity of manifestation, derived from the triplicity of the one, and there in stanza 5 they were nothing other than the 3, 5, and 7 strides taken by Fohat. So the shloka indicates that the process is downward, but I think we have to be very careful of such a word, obviously. It's not a direction in space, but an exteriorization, an externalization, by which the potentialities of the reawakened energies are, by the very thrust of their own dynamism, actualized. And you remember that in Ginther's threefold, from facticity came authentic utterance, which is actualizing, is capable of actualizing. So in one place he translates it as actuality, exhibited then in the multiplicity of phenomena in existence. This dynamic thrust, as we've already pointed out in earlier discussions, is omnidirectional in its oscillating radiation outward. It's rotatory, circumgyratory, all of these terms are used in describing it. It's a dynamic thrust of this original singularity. Now the shloka, as we note, concludes with the awe-inspiring statement that all of these energies, creative hierarchies or modes of consciousness, outward thrusting emanations, all of them are nothing other than thou, me, him, as well as those who watch over thee and thy mother, the earth, Bhumi. The manifest universe, now we can say, is the body of the divine man. And if we're still trying to comprehend how the entire hierarchy of creative powers can constitute our very being, at the same time that it constitutes the manifested universe, and also watches over this present sphere of our existence, the globe D, we need only turn to HPB's concluding statement in her commentary on this shloka. You see, I'm not going through these orders of creative hierarchies because I really don't feel that's essential at this point. But she says, in her, where's this? Page 222, it's the very conclusion, it's the very final portion of this shloka. Alone, the divine ray, the Atman, proceeds directly from the One. When asked how that can be, how is it possible to conceive that these gods or angels can be at the same time their own emanations and their personal selves? Is it in the same sense as in the material world, where the Son is in one way his Father, being his blood, the bone of his bone, and the very flesh of his flesh? To this the teachers answer, verily it is so. But one has to go deep into the mystery of being before one can fully comprehend this truth. You see, it's the very conclusion of this. So that how is it possible to conceive that these creative energies, these hierarchies, can be at the same time their own emanations and their personal selves? And so she gives us, I think, an analogy, but also says that one has to, in order to really comprehend it, go very deep into the mystery of being. Well, that's something that I suppose we each have to really pursue. But a further quotation may be helpful in explaining this mystery. In Volume 2, which I didn't bring with me, but Volume 2, pages 33 to 34, HPB quotes the occult commentary. And I think it's helpful at this stage.
What pages?
Volume 2, pages 33 and 34. And again, I don't know, it would be in Volume 3 of the Adyar edition, and I don't know, therefore, what... I brought only my first volume with me because carrying books is rather heavy when one travels. But I have the quotation. In any event, she's quoting the occult commentary. And she states, all sentient, complete beings, full septenary men or higher beings, are furnished in their beginnings with forms and organisms in full harmony with the nature and state of the sphere they inhabit. The spheres of being, or centers of life, which are isolated nuclei breeding their men and their animals, are numberless. All have a double physical and spiritual nature. The nucleoles are eternal and everlasting, the nuclei periodical and finite. The nucleoles form part of the absolute. They are the embrasures of that black, impenetrable fortress which is forever concealed from human or even deionic sight. The nuclei are the light of eternity escaping therefrom. That's a marvelous, marvelous statement, isn't it? Was this one that you quoted, Adam? Or yes, I think you quoted it. It is that light which condenses into the forms of the lords of being, the first and the highest of which are collectively Jivatman. From these downwards, formed from the ever-consolidating waves of that light, which becomes on the objective plane gross matter, proceed the numerous hierarchies of the creative forces. Thus there is but one absolute upadhi in the spiritual sense, that's one absolute basis, nourishing container, from, on, and in which are built for the manvantaric purposes the countless basic centers on which proceed the universal, cyclic, and individual evolutions during the active period. It's a tremendous statement. It deserves a lot of thought, a lot of consideration. Did you find the reference in the Adyar edition? But it is there in Volume 2, pages 33 to 34. I think it deserves a very great deal of consideration. So it is one. Perhaps again I might remind you that it seems to me if we can see the concept of number in the way in which I earlier suggested, in which it is referred to in a number of primitive cultures, that number is all in terms of derivations of one. Everything is one, and the one, so two is not 2, 1 plus 1, but it is the two-ness of one, the threeness of one, the multiplicity of one, that we come much closer then to the esoteric doctrine, that it all, as Ianthe is fond of quoting, all is one thing. I keep off the thing, because all is one process, you see, which is really what's after. One is the thingness of it. It's one essence, one process of the one. And that is the way in which then it is they who are thou, me, him, because whatever the multiplication, remember, 1 times 1 times 1 times 1, and the process, as we see later, is indeed that of multiplication. And when you multiply, what do you have? 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 is what? 1, isn't it? Is that right? And it is a process of multiplication. So you never get away from the one. Further, this is so because we learned earlier that having its circumference everywhere, the boundless has therefore its central point also everywhere. In other words, is in every point in the universe. This is, I'm taking a quote from page 114 of volume 1. Having its the natural symbol, therefore, evident nature, which having its circumference everywhere, the boundless, has therefore its central point also everywhere. In other words, is in every point of the universe. The invisible deity is thus also the Dhyani Chohans, the Rishis, the primitive 7 and the 9 without, and 10, including their synthetical unit, from which it steps into man. Marvelous statement that I remind you of here. So it is only one. So while we may see these chief hierarchies as she outlines them in her commentary, you see, and which are in also quoted in Adam's book, it is all one. We never get away from that. We can't, because this is that system. So the divine paradigm underlying the entire process of becoming is, as we've said before, heavenly man, the divine man, the sum total. Just as that which is formless yet sentient becomes through the dynamic thrust of its inherent life, or through Fohat, if you prefer, stabilized into form and forms, so again, to quote from the commentary, and this is page 183 of volume 1, where she again quotes the commentary, that every form on earth and every speck in space strives in its efforts towards self-formation to follow the model placed for it in the heavenly man. So it's appropriate that stanza 7, the cosmogonic process, is now going to reveal, while recapitulating, reveals its presence, the totality, in this model. Now that's not you and I in our physical forms, obviously, but it is the collectivity of the human stage, as I see it. So here is the model, you see. However, we must keep in mind, again, that there are two aspects of the heavenly man. I put it this way because I think we have to, or perhaps it's better to say that the heavenly man has a dual character, you know. In a sense, this comes in at almost every stage. Incidentally, I'll just throw in here that one sees this in this Tibetan text, that each one of the palace guards has its tranquil aspect and its fearsome aspect. And in a sense, the fury of it is in the dealing with, absorbing the multiplicity of the external world and having to deal with it. The furious, I mean, after all, we all become, subject to these furies within us at times, which is that dual aspect. But this dual aspect of the heavenly man is pointed up by H.P.B. I think it's on page 215. It's part of her commentary now, in which she says, the first heavenly man is the unmanifested spirit of the universe and ought never to be degraded into microprosopus, the lesser face or countenance, the prototype of man on the terrestrial plane. And in a footnote, she has, the microprosopus is, as just said, the logos manifested, and of such there are many. So we have the unmanifested eternal logos, she puts in a footnote, one with the Father, and then the lesser face or countenance, the prototype of man on the terrestrial plane. The first heavenly man is the unmanifested spirit of the universe. There is a tendency to of course, as she puts it, degrade or to confine him, to sully him with this, but with the lesser countenance. But she's very clear. Now, the lesser has to be a reflection, which becomes distorted.
It looks like there's a contradiction here. At the bottom of 214, she refers to Adam Kamlod, or the manifested logos. Then you go 3/4 way down 215, you see the first heavenly man is the unmanifested.
Is the unmanifested spirit of the universe. Yes. Yes. Like I don't think there is a contradiction. You see, the Ein Sof, whose ray uses Adam Kadmon, or the manifested logos. And here, of course, she is turning to the Kabbalistic system. Ein Sof.
The objective.
Yes. You see, earlier she has put earlier in that, in the Zohar and the Chaldean Book of Numbers, well, no longer appears as it does in the Chaldean Book of Numbers. True enough, Ein Sof, the absolute endless no thing, also uses the form of the One, the manifested heavenly man, as its chariot or vehicle.
Where are you looking at?
Earlier on 214, after her introductory sentence under B, you see. Or to descend into and manifest through in the phenomenal world. So the One has to be, as it were, it's the form of the One, it's the vehiculing, the utilizing of a form in which it can express, in which it can manifest. So it doesn't seem to me there's a contradiction, Jeffrey.
Well, there's a bit halfway down 215, which probably solves this. For the 10 limbs of the heavenly man, or the 10 Zephyroth, now they are the manifested.
That's the manifested, yes.
But
that's
the first heavenly man
yes.
is the unmanifested.
Yes, that's right.
Spirit.
Yes, that's right. So, Yanti?
She does, it seems to me, attach some importance to the actual physical evolution.
Yeah, very much so.
That you read just now, man as the highest physical and ultimate form on this earth.
That's right.
And then in the bit that you quoted, just before stanza 7, that is the very end of stanza 6,
yes.
You quoted a little bit from Carlyle. And that, if I may go on for a little bit, see, I've done a little bit of work on this, and the end product is likely to appear in the Theosophist before very long. She is speaking about the form of man, and also about the indwelling reality. And at the end of the previous paragraph, this is page 211, well, just a little way back, of this subject we can say no more, as though she is speaking of something too holy, too remote, not to be brought down to our level, except to add that in every age, even in our own, there have been great intellects who have understood the problem correctly. And it is interesting, a little exercise for one's spare time, is to make a list of the great intellects of whom, with whom she would be acquainted through their works, either contemporaries or just perhaps during the previous century. It's a very interesting list, and people who seem to have uttered glimmerings of this. And she immediately begins to quote from Carlyle. And this amazing statement from Carlyle, it's a lecture on heroes, which he was giving in London in 1840. The essence of our being, the mystery in us that calls itself I. What words have we for such things? It is a breath of heaven. The highest being reveals himself in man. And then she is still quoting from Carlyle, but at this point Carlyle is quoting from someone else.
Carlyle is quoting Novalis,
From Novalis. And for a long time I searched for Novalis in encyclopedias and all over the place, and never found him until Beata got me a book by him, and about him with a biography. And the reason why you never find him is that that was not his name. His name was George Frederick Philip von Hardenberg. But why he chose to be Novalis didn't matter. But unfortunately, in the Adyar edition, the punctuation goes wrong at that point, because the whole of the paragraph is Carlyle and not HPB commenting on Carlyle. But she has chosen to give the whole of that remarkable quotation from Novalis in Carlyle. There is but one temple in the universe, and that is the body of man. Nothing is holier than that high form. See, and Carlyle comments, but she approves, obviously, because she quotes him. This sounds like a mere flourish of rhetoric, but it is not so. If well meditated, it will turn out to be a scientific fact, the expression of the actual truth of the thing. We are the miracle of miracles, the great inscrutable mystery. She has chosen to drop off the last two words of Carlyle, because what he really said was, we are the miracle of miracles, the great inscrutable mystery of God.
And that is in the original edition.
It's in Boris de Zirkov. He's put it back, but it's not in the original.
Oh, yes.
Boris has put it back.
He's put it back.
Yes,
he's put it back, yes.
He's put it back, but it wasn't there.
No.
Which page?
212. 212.
Boris has chosen to include.
Yes, to include.
George Frederick von who?
Pardon?
George
Frederick von.
George Frederick Philip von Hardenberg. I'm doing this from memory.
How do you spell it?
That's right. George Frederick Philip von Hardenberg.
Hardenberg.
Yeah, how do you spell it?
Harden, I think it's Berg. Sounds all right. I can check on that, and if you give me notice of the question.
Yes. No, I had done some research and I found Novalis was not Novalis. There's nobody under that name. It is a pseudonym. It's a pseudonym. But I found it in a glossary that that was a pseudonym for, I'd forgotten the name of the fellow that was. But if I'd had a name like that, I would have called it Novalis. Much easier.
Yeah, that's right.
The sun is attempting to come through. It is 45 minutes. I suggest you take 2 minutes, run out into the sun while it's quickly there, and I'd like to refer you now in this connection to a very interesting series of articles which HPB presented in her journal, Lucifer. There she translated from the Russian portions of a work called The Diary of an Old Physician by one Dr. N.I. Pirogov, P-I-R-O-G-O-F-F. Dr. I.N. Pirogov, I suppose. I don't know Russian. Don't know how it's pronounced. Anyway, who was evidently an eminent Russian surgeon and pathologist whose views, HPB said, closely approximated the occult teachings of Theosophy. Interesting. Leave it to HPB to come on that sort of thing. The entire article, or rather series of articles, which appeared under the title Problems of Life, is in Collected Writings, Volume 12, page 410. And it's beginning on page 410, continues, of course. It's quite a series of articles, and she translated this from the Russian. I want to quote just one paragraph, because it's rather interesting. And at the moment, I'm not certain whether this is her comment on what this Russian surgeon was saying. I failed to make a note of that. Or whether, I think this is really a translation of his statement. As in the microcosm, man, so in the macrocosm, or the universe. Every organ in it is a sentient entity, and every particle of matter or substance, from the physical molecule up to the spiritual atom, is a cell, a nerve center, which communicates with the brain stuff, or that substance on the plane of divine thought in which the prime ideation is produced. Therefore was man produced in the image of God, or divine nature. Every cell in the human organism mysteriously corresponds with a like cell in the divine organism of the manifested universe. Only the latter cell assumes in the macrocosm the gigantic proportions of an intelligent unit in this or that hierarchy of beings.
Quite put it better myself.
Yes. Quite an incredible, you see. I came on that because I was fascinated by this, well, when I was looking through volume 12, and Boris had called my attention to this, her translation of it's certain portions of a work called The Diary of an Old Physician. But there we are, you see. It's a very good one, and I think that entire series, which she published under Problems of Life, is really very well worth reading. Well, all of her writings, and I think so many of the things in the collected writings are delightful to read. One gets the full range, of course, in the collected writings. One gets the full range of HPB, from the metaphysician, certainly the knower of the wisdom, the teacher, to the punster, the witty individual, who the satirical individual at times, the one who could, write in almost any vein.
particularly in some of the writings, and one where I think 2 or 3 people have taken the title of their writings and essays from, the Beacon Light, isn't it?
Yes.
At the end of one of her books.
Yes.
The social implications of a knowledge of theosophy.
Yes.
Where she spells this out. Wonderful.
Marvelous.
I mean,
It's,
a real
yes.
goal for us to aim at.
Oh, yes. Well, the meaning...
Light, wasn't it?
The Beacon Light or something like that.
Translation from the French.
Yes, it was. Yes, that was an article she wrote in French, and Boris has translated it. It's interesting. Boris, of course, was naturally he knew Russian very well. He also knew French quite well, and he retranslated in many cases to ensure what was the accuracy, and he went back to the original when he could get at it. Not always could he get at it, but when he could, he did retranslate to see how she had translated a certain word. So, well, the meaning of all of this, in terms of the microphosopus, we have to consider again when we come to Sloka 5 of stanza 7. So I'm not going to go into it further right now, because she does, in stanza 5, deal with this again, this whole subject. Sloka 5, yes. So just a few words then on the hierarchy of creative powers which underlie and are involved in the entire process of bringing man to birth. These are not only our ancestors, if we can put it this way, they are ourselves. They are present. And HPB states that the chief hierarchies are hinted at in the Great Quaternary. She's already indicated that the hierarchy itself is divided into 4 and 3 within the 12 great orders, recorded, as she says, in the 12 signs of the zodiac, which gives us a clue as to their, what shall we say, their qualities, their attributes. Now, of course, there is an interesting reference to the 12 hierarchies of Dhyanis, which occurs in volume 2, pages 26 to 27, where the Chinese concept of the heavenly man is spoken of, stating that the progeny of Fohi, or the heavenly man, are called the 12 Tianhuang. I guess I need Marianne to pronounce it more correctly for me. The 12 hierarchies of Dhyanis with human faces and dragon bodies, the dragon standing for divine wisdom or spirit, and they create men by incarnating themselves in 7 figures of clay made in the shape of those Tianhuang. How should I be pronouncing it?
No, it's fine. It's
Oh. Yeah. Then she adds, the 12 Aesir of the Scandinavian Eddas do the same. So there, again, as I commented on last week, she draws on all the mythologies of peoples to show that these concepts are found again and again and again in these great mythological texts of mythological history. Now, as to the great quaternary, which it appears constitutes the chief hierarchies, as HPB says, she refers us to the exoteric tradition of the 4 bodies of Brahma. And Barborka in the Divine Plan gives us an abbreviated version of the allegory found in the Vishnu Purana. The Puranas, of course, are generally, they are later, of course, than the Upanishads, considerably later than the Dharmashastras, in fact. But the Puranas are indeed the retelling of the great mythological tales, allegories of the Aryans. There are 3 major subdivision of the Puranas, you may know, the ones that have to do with Brahma, those with Vishnu, and those with Shiva. And she quotes a great deal from all of them, in fact, but very often from the Vishnu Purana, which is those under that. They're sometimes divided according to the gunas, incidentally. And so we have the Rajasic Puranas, the Sattvic, and the Tamasic Puranas. But the Barborica gives us, and so it's the easiest way to get at it, this tradition in terms of the allegory found in the Vishnu Purana. After the world had been created by Brahma, the great deity bethought himself of peopling the world, which he proceeded to do by constructing progeny through his will, assuming 4 bodies for the purpose: the bodies of night, Ratri, day, Ahan, twilight, Sandhya, and dawn, Jyotsna, giving birth to 4 great groups of beings, which generally are known as the Asuras, the gods, the Pitris, and men. Now, one of the beautiful aspects of this allegory is the phrase that is used to describe the whole creative process employed by Brahma as the creative potency, having concentrated his mind into itself. I think it's the most descriptive phrase that could be used for that process, which is the result of an interior focusing of energy. And we find similar phrases, of course, in the Vedas, as well as the mythological texts, and I already referred to that in my first talk in regard to some of the great themes of mythology.
Please, where does Barborica
Yes.
that?
In the Divine Plan, I think it's around page 256. Yes, in the Divine Plan, Barborica deals with it. Now, Barborica suggests that that there may be clues to understanding this Puranic allegory of this quaternity. The concept of the Asuras, for example, may be puzzling, since that term is usually translated, the Asuras, as the demons. But here, Barborica suggests the esoteric interpretation is simply that these are gods or a hierarchy of an earlier era, and therefore are born of Brahma's body of night, whereas the Suras, born of Brahma's body of day, are the hierarchies of our present age, the gods of the present age. The Pitris, born of Brahma's body of twilight, are similarly the product of a previous kalpa, more specifically the moon chain, and constitute, therefore, our own immediate ancestors, the lunar Pitris, the Bahashads. And our humanity issued then from Brahma's body of dawn. Now, the same allegory with the esoteric interpretation in much longer form is given by HPB in Volume 2, pages 58 to 60, if you want to make a note to that. And she concludes the explanation there, Volume 2, pages 58 to 60, with a most intriguing statement. The whole philosophy of the so-called creation of the good and evil in this world, and of the whole cycle of Manvantaric results therefrom, hangs on the correct comprehension of these 4 bodies of Brahma. Make of it what you will. I'm not sure that I understand it, but I present it. The whole philosophy of the so-called creation of the good and evil in this world.
This is page 58?
I think it may be towards page 60. She concludes that. I think it's on page 60, isn't it? Yeah, it's at the end of this. The allegory is given pages 58 to 60. Page 60. Volume 2. You come on it, Jeffrey?
No, but came across some other words. The true meaning, esoteric meaning of this allegory must now be explained.
Yes,
On page
that's right. Yes, that's right. You see. I merely gave the abbreviated, Barborka gives it in abbreviated form, which is why I simply referred to it. But
No,
the
because-
whole philosophy of the so-called creation of the good and evil in this world and of the whole cycle of manvantaric results therefrom, that is, hangs on the correct comprehension of these four bodies of Brahma. So, make of it, as I say, what you will. I don't understand it, but I bring it to your attention. Now, these hierarchies, I'm not going to repeat all of what has already been given us in Adam's book and what Adam has talked about, but rather just to point up some interesting things as she gives it now in this first shloka of stanza 7, and which she explains further. The shining seven, as the shloka calls them, who have become personified in the seven creative rishis, all of them mind-born as sons of the first Lord or Avalokiteshvara. You remember that the name can mean the looked-at sound, but also the Lord who looks down, that is, descends into form, assuming the myriad vestures of manifested existence. The highest group, then, we are told, is composed of the divine flames, the formless fiery breaths, and later we're informed that it is from the one divine flame is lit the three descending groups. This concept of fire we have come on before, and it is indeed one of the first representations of the initial emanation. There's a number of statements that the essence of fire is the life and light of the universe. We have the fiery whirlwind, Fohat, and so on. Fohat as the vehicle for that fiery whirlwind. In this connection, I would refer you to page 114 in Volume 2. Where she deals with this further, I think in a very interesting way, that fire is a key to understanding, in a sense, the entire cosmogonic process, both as a symbol of the primordial creative act and of that supreme intelligence in man, buddhi, which is alone capable of inflaming manas. Here on 114, she says, the spirit beyond manifested nature is the fiery breath in its absolute unity. In the manifested universe, it is the central spiritual sun, the electric fire of all life. In our system, it is the visible sun, the spirit of nature, the terrestrial God. And in, on, and around the earth, the fiery spirit thereof. Air, fluidic fire. Water, liquid fire. Earth, solid fire. All is fire, ignis in its ultimate constitution. It is the creator, the destroyer, the preserver. The primitive names of the gods are all connected with fire, from Agni, the Aryan, to the Jewish God who is a consuming fire. So it becomes obvious then that this becomes then the key to understanding, I think, the entire process, because it's a symbol both of this primordial creative act, if you like to call it that, and of that supreme intelligence in man, buddhi, which enflames manas for the human creative power that both enlightens and inspires. Fire that sense, the gift of the gods, and we're reminded of the great Promethean myth, the theft of fire, for which the hero god is chained to physical existence. It's a powerful symbol representing the first creative hierarchy, and present, therefore, throughout all succeeding hierarchies of creative powers, essential in its nature.
It's interesting, if people haven't done this, we're told, that we can discover all these things from within ourselves.
Yes.
And I remember years ago doing some thinking about the elements, and I came across this fact that fire must be predominant, must come first, must pervade all the rest. It was quite clear to the way I was looking at it. And there are a number of other things that happen to one, and you see this, and the great joy is when you've discovered something for yourself and then find it
confirmed in the Secret Doctrine. I think this is, it really is exciting when you really,
in fact, anticipate the book teaching by looking for yourself.
Yes. Now, this is so true, and while we have difficulty coming on this, you see, Janine Miller has commented that the Rig Veda is perhaps the only one among the world's scriptures that clearly ascribes this primordial radiation as the all-blazing contemplation of the Supreme. The Rig Veda does it, and of course the word that is used in the Vedic hymn is tapas, from the root verb to top, to burn. And it's generally this inner incandescence that blazes forth from the heart of the Eternal. So the highest group, you see, of the chief hierarchies, says HPB, is composed of the divine flames, but this must be present throughout. Would you say, Edita?
The philosophy of the antiquity, the fire, the philosopher.
Yes, that's right. Yes, and of course in alchemy, the bringing of the fire, the heating. So it's in the Vedas. It's interesting, in the Vedas, fire, or Agni, the god Agni, is born of the waters. So of the original all-pervasive substance, which is later called Akasha by HPB. The noumenon of ether, which HPB says is that in its purest form is fire. Page 87 of volume 1, which in its purest form is fire. So we can begin to see that this is the underlying. As I say, I'm not going again into all of these numbers, that are delineated there, but just quickly to cover some of these points. And then, it's virtually time for coffee, and after coffee, then I'd like to turn to then seeing this in terms of, if we can, this projection as the Tibetan text points it out. Is defined, and in fact, the numbers that we are given in Sloka 1, which in one sense, you see, of naturally recall us to the numbers which have been given us in previous stanzas. This emphasis on number occurs again and again, as you have undoubtedly begun to recognize in reading the stanzas. And at times it becomes very confusing. Now, in the Tibetan text to which Günther is referring us, which he has translated, the number, which presents us with the structure of the system, if you like, because number defines to a large extent the structural proportions, if I can put it that way. It seems a strange way to put it, but I think that helps. It is, in a sense, the structural proportion in which, and the manner of the emanations. Here we have it in terms of a palace that is adorned, well adorned with jewels and with, of course, a huge retinue surrounding the king. There's a great deal of adornment that is taking place. The vault of the sky bathed in light, the first. Gold inlaid with turquoises, the second. A peacock's egg glistening in 5 colors. A crystal whose flashing never ceases. These are similes that are used. The way in which flashes of light burst from a crystal under favorable conditions, and a bird breaks out from its egg when it has been fully hatched, and light and rays issuing from the sun's energy. These are, again, all similes. And there's a great deal in the text about this fantastic adornment of the palace. So I'd like to call your attention to what I've now put at the bottom of the board. The word cosmos comes from the Greek word kosmio, which means to adorn. And it is the same root we have in the word cosmetic, which you may not have realized. And I think this often comes as a shock to people. That,
I thought there was some harmony in it somewhere.
yes, it is a harmonious adornment, but it is to adorn. And that's really what the Greek means. And so presumably we put on our cosmetics in some harmonious manner, yes, very true, you see. And when we do not, when it becomes grotesque, you see, as in, you see, the clown figure or the devil figure, it's a grotesqueness of the adornment. And it's that which shocks us then. But this is, in a sense then, the adornment of the one. And so it may be equally different to keep the king and all the various kings and queens, which we mentioned yesterday, separate. It's interesting. I don't know who he is, Sir Geoffrey Vickers, but he's written a work on, I can't remember the name of it now. In any event, it has to do with value systems. And I should have made a note of the precise title of his work. But it's Value Systems and Social Process. It's quoted in Eric Jansch, and I first came across him in reading Jansch, I must say. So I really don't know who he is, but since he has a Sir in front of his name, I presume he must be British, and at least been knighted at some point or other. He suggests that, and Jansch quotes this, and Ginther makes reference to it also, but he suggests that as embodied beings installed in the world in which we participate, we cannot but live in anything but an appreciated world. A phrase that Vickers has developed that Jansch uses. It's an appreciated world. It has about it, therefore, that harmony to which Ginther referred, you see. Appreciated because it's an active and creatively sensitive world in which we are participants. And it's we're living individuals. It's interesting. Ginther comments that this appreciation cannot be encompassed within the outworn body-mind dualism, nor be reduced to the equally barren monism of spirit as postulated by idealist philosophies. For as living individuals, we are a dynamic system which simultaneously exhibits both physical and psychic, and I think we could add spiritual, if you like, dimensions. So this fullness of ourselves in the world adds to this appreciation in that sense. But as Günther points out, a human being is an unending task and not something once done, forever done. And of course, I think this is very much in line with what we've been discussing and what is presented to us in philosophy. Man was not created the septenary being he now is, and so on, and that there is a future, that there is indeed this further unfoldment. And so there must be a pervasive, again to quote Günther, there must be a pervasive sentience which ensures the continuity of culture as the continued actualization of human potential. Very wonderful phrase, I think. Well, then in this, therefore, the king with his queen, and I'm only going to take the first of the kings, which is, you remember, perception, which is coupled with the first of the queens, therefore, coming into presence. He has vassals, he has palace guards, he has inner and outer functionaries, as they are called in the system. They are representatives, then, these vassals, representatives of him, both in an inner way and an outer way. And just following through this one, you see, now you can follow through all of them in the same way, but just following through this first one of perception, which is the beholding, the possibility. It disposes us to perceiving. These are then, in the text, the act phase, the positive act phase of the king, reflected outward, reflected then in the object phase. Now it may seem very difficult to separate the inner and the outer. And indeed, Gunnar, this is page 112, he gives a diagram of it, which is pursued further in a diagram on page 116. So these are very useful diagrams, which I think he has given us, and I've given it in very brief form here. But the inner functionaries are said to be dispositions, that is, tendencies for perceptual programs to develop. How these inner functionaries, inner vassals, the vassalage of the king, are tendencies for perceptual programs, while the outer, so all of that is the first half of it, the outer functionaries are the execution of the program in its two aspects. And so it is by these acts that the one is made present as the comprehensible image of bringing about perception in its multiple forms. And so the inner vassals, and I'm not giving you the names, as I said before, I can't pronounce the Tibetan anyway, so there's no point in putting up the Tibetan terms. If you want, you can get the book and get the Tibetan terms, but I can't pronounce them. So I'm content to use the act phase in English translations that he has given us. That there is, in other words, a disposition, a tendency for perception to reveal itself in what he calls a visual program, which then leads to, under the coming into presence, what is seeable. An auditory program, which leads, of course, into what is hearable, an olfactory program, which leads into what is smellable, and a gustatory program, what is tasteable. Now, it's interesting, you see, there are only 4 here, as there were 4 in the original, but the sense of touch is an all-over perception. It's an all-encompassing perception, therefore, and is not part of this fourfold inner program. So the fifth sense of touch, you see, is an all-over.
Which isn't making the body of what is in the center?
It probably, well, it could be that too. I think he would use that also as a definition. But it's all encompassing and also the focused touch. Now as these turn outward, the outer functionaries, and again he doesn't give us the diagram, but one can picture this. You remember the palace, you see, within the space that is no place at all, you see. And so there are those vassals who are closer to the king, who stand close to him, and their counterparts are looking out, are transmitting the message from the inner to the outer. So you get a kind of situation of this, you see, the one looking closest to the king, transmitting it to the one that is looking out, you see. And so these are not the guards yet. The palace guards are, of course, on the outside of the palace. So we have to come to that later. But I thought today we would just look into these. So outward, of course, the visual program is transmitted to the act phase of seeing, but then what is seeable becomes the past. And this is, I think, a rather interesting suggestion. You see, what is seeable is everything that has been. The great have-beens of the universe. Seeing, it occurred to me that in one sense, we never see things as they are, but always as they have been. Because a fraction of time has elapsed in the very process of the translation of the vibrations which reach the retina, translated into that area of the brain, which is the visual perception area, and so on. Its translation into I see you, I see a table, I see a book, and so on. In that slight second, everything could have changed, because time, of course, is well, what happens to it?
The stars, for example.
Yes.
They have died.
They have died, yes.
Billion years ago, and you see them.
We see them, you see. When you
You
take
see
a
the
picture
past.
of a galaxy, it's not as it is now, but as it was perhaps 40 billion years ago. So, yes. But this is true even in microseconds in the act of perception. So the seeing, in its outer turned aspect, gives the object phase of the past. Hearing, the auditory program, what is hearable, is the present. Now again, time has elapsed, but it's interesting how this is developed in the Tibetan text. It becomes then the present. What is hearable is the present, which is the instant of hearing, the collectivity of instants. The olfactory program obviously gives rise to the act of smelling, which is a coming into presence of the future.
Go on, tell us.
This is interesting, and he doesn't spend a lot of time on this, but see if I can find his. He doesn't really go into this too much, so I really can't explain it. But
Are we talking about higher senses rather than our normal senses?
oh yes, that's right. Well, it's the whole, it's the sense throughout. This is, of course, a process-oriented view. You have to realize that. And
He doesn't give enough attention to this particular aspect. But anyway, this is the way it comes out. Tasting, then, the gustatory program, of course, gives rise to tasting as an act phase, which is the object phase of temporality as such. Explains it. He defines it. Now again, I'm at a loss to say how to define this, you see.
Could be something to do with anticipation.
Yes.
Something to cut, like
Something
the
to
smell of a
cut.
nice dinner.
Yes.
That's the smelling.
That's the smelling. Now, tasting, temporality as such is a kind of eternal now, the immediacy.
There's such a frequent phrase in the Buddhist scriptures of everything is of one taste.
Yes, that's right.
Very frequent.
Very frequent, that's
Yes.
right. Yes, there is that.
What does that mean?
Well, that's...
As you wish.
Now, you see, these vassals, then, it's a multiplicity. And it's a coordinated activity of phase transitions, as he calls it. The basic phase is general sentience as that which disposes us to be in touch with, you see, and that's why, again, touching, you see. This phase, or field of general sentience, gives us the intentional structuring in which attention can be focused on the act phase. So everything then becomes the touchable. But it's interesting how one works this out in terms of the number system here. You see, I have not correlated it. I told you that yesterday. But I think there's much yet remains to be done. So the body, the physical body, is properly seen to be the product of a feedback process which incorporates a variety of specific features of the dynamic properties of the field. So within the body, all of these are met. Coming back to what Ianthi said too, of the importance of the body. Because here it is focused. Now, there are suggestions that in the Hindu system, the tattvas give rise to these organs of perception, which are then expressed through the physical body. So one has that very much. So the living being is, as he puts it, the living person is a well-orchestrated process.
I think I may have mentioned this on some previous occasion, but I remember there was a lecture that Geoffrey gave at headquarters when there was the vase of flowers. I think they were these dried flowers, I can't remember, on the piano. And he turned to them and asked some questions to get the audience thinking. How and when did colour emerge and scent in plants, and correspondingly, how and when did our senses evolve to make it possible for us to perceive colour and smell and so on. A twofold process, one in ourselves, the evolution of the organs and their possibilities, their powers, and one in the external universe, plant life, animal life, and so on.
The qualities of things which we perceive with the sense. If
Yes.
they didn't, as it were, radiate those qualities, we would be unaware of them.
That's right. Now, as Ginther puts it, you see, what is possible is that we can actualize the potentialities of all of this hierarchy. The royal household, as he puts it, presents a hierarchy of operations which may be conceived of as moving along a vertical axis in both a downward and upward direction, information passing both ways between the highest and lowest levels. And this experience becomes an experience of what he calls, again, you see, I told you his language is not easy, but it's fascinating to compare with what we have here. A system of interlocking intentionalities which results as a nexus of potentialities, I can, resulting in I can. This I can is a property of the whole system, a royal household. But unlike the specific intentions of the members of this household, with their specific bipolarity, the I can is an overall met in man. Therefore, I can see, I can hear, I can smell, I can taste, and incidentally, this, just to make it confusing, and I've brought this out, because it's a threefold process. Now the complexity becomes, if you think the complexity here, you see, of these numbers, the complexity is even more, because this is only in terms of our embodiment. All of this also is related to authentic utterance through speech, and all of it through resonating concern through mentation. So we have not only this inner and outer, each a fourfold of just one of the kings, and a fourfold kingness summarized in the fifth, but also a triplicity. So it seems to me we are talking in very much the same way as these creative hierarchies. But Jeffrey, you remember we talked about this horizontal and vertical. Let me just suggest that he deals with this, that each hierarchical level also has its horizontal dimension, which gives experience its spatial and orientational texture, whereby it becomes a world engagement with the entire field. That we have an entry into the field of the creative, which is the creative hierarchy. And so it gives experience its spatial orientation. Such a world engagement is centered in the experiencer as the interaction point of the vertical and horizontal dimension of a spatial temporal system. The vertical dimension is the hierarchy of functions imaged as kings, functionaries, and so on. And therefore, each of these functionaries has a different posture. And there's a whole long development of this posture that each one takes. And what they hold, of course. It's quite incredible, because some of them are seated cross-legged, of course, some of them with right leg up, some with left leg up, and so on, you see. So the posture reveals then this vertical dimension. The horizontal dimension is implicit in the array of the postures as a process of posturing. So both again in the field, but our point of entry. Well, I'm not sure how much sense that makes, but I think it is a very interesting development and way in which we can begin to see how all of these creative hierarchies are indeed met in us, because each in one sense represents a functionary of the unitary, the one, it seems to me. And yet met in I as being my body, in which I can, then I am able to contact all of this. There's some marvelous now let me just read you then. The palace itself is a field of concern, an appreciated world, not a walled-in container. The royal household is the dynamic unfoldment of being becoming human, not the result of a random movement, but the intricate self-organizing of that intelligence which pervades being, therefore awe-inspiring in its majestic wondrousness. It is, isn't it? So the royal household is this dynamic unfoldment of being becoming human, not the result of random movement, but the intricate self-organizing of that intelligence which pervades being. Consciousness is primary. And so it illustrates, as he says, the aesthetic creation of a world in which mankind can live in a rapturous enjoyment which is fundamental to life. And so the text, this is the image poetically envisioned in the Tibetan text. Inside this castle, decorated with beauty, with beings' display of spontaneous wealth. See, that's why it's the cosmos. It's adorned. This decorated with beings' display of spontaneous wealth. There is seated on his throne the king, self-existing, pristine cognitiveness, primary consciousness. The self-existent one, who is, of course, the Avalokiteshvara who looks down, who is the looked-at sun. And while all creative stirrings of this pristine cognitiveness, assuming the semblance of a continuous coming and going, have become the king's ministers administering their domains, he, the king, together with his noble queen, self-abiding disposition of pristine cognitiveness, and with his son and servants, self-arising bestowals of sense, so the senses, remains immersed, the king, remains immersed in the swirl of ultimate bliss, glowing in its own light with no divisiveness. So it's a magnificent picture that is presented.
No divisiveness means no division.
No division. No division. There is an auto-presencing, as he calls it, self-presence.
And so on page 216, we could note this as a little dagger note there. This consciousness, in inverted commas, has no relation to our consciousness.
That's right.
This is the consciousness of the king.
That's right. And it has, and therefore, you see, his son, his servants, the functionaries, the palace guards, and so on, and you see, and we must approach it. Therefore, one approaches the palace cautiously, as he says. One doesn't storm its walls, so to speak, demand to see the king. You know, I mean, we may, but we have to get through all of the functionaries. So he calls it the aesthetics of the virtual patterns.
He says, man is the superior being.
Yes.
By reason of experience.
That's right. By experience, you see. And that's what he's pointing out here too, you see.
You don't have to be put off by the cards.
No, oh no. And that's what he's saying here, you see, which is what I was reading, you see. It's an experience. We actualize the potentialities in terms of experience. It's a living system in which, you see, it's also said that therefore it's difficult that each and everything carries the mark of the king. It is difficult to pass beyond this marking by the energy of the indisputable internal logic of being as mystery. So what is meant, suggests Günther, what is meant by being difficult to escape, being's marking, is that a living being tends to meet the standards set by being, which, however, are set with respect to the specific aims and requirements of the individual within the total framework of the evolutionary process, of which, in figurative language, the king is the guiding principle. So we are marked. This is the mark. And you can't escape it. Just as by a king's own seal the palace walls are marked, so the whole person is marked by the insignia of true individuality. And then he goes on that this is the ultimate yoga approach. With regard to the ultimate yoga approach, it is said that being marks the whole universe.
That's reading again, That's worth reading again.
With regard
to mark of individuality.
Yeah. Just as by a king's own seal, the palace walls are marked. This is from another text, Ron Zampa. Again, I'm not pronouncing the Tibetan correctly, but this is what he has to say. Just as by a king's own seal the palace walls are marked, so the whole person is marked by the insignia of true individuality. So the points suggest Günther to the necessity of restoring dignity and value to one's ordinary existence by a transformative vision. The practice of yoga is a focusing on the integrity and wholeness of the person's growth and development, to which the term true individuality applies. True individuality is a pointer to the intrinsic coherence and value of the system, human being, which is thus godlike in its own right. And so he quotes then, again, a beautiful simile from another Tibetan text. In this underlying creativity of ours, which is like a golden plate, we have to coax its godlike structure, its God structure, which is like molten quicksilver, so as to cultivate imaginally this whole process into becoming the articulated presence of being's divine dynamics. To coax it out. Coax it out. Cultivate imaginally. This is the visual meditation, isn't it? This whole process into becoming the articulated presence of being's divine dynamics. Well, you see, here we have it, that it is they who are thou, me, him, O Manu, they who watch over thee and thy mother. We are that. So, as I say, I've become so fascinated by this Tibetan text, it may not appeal to all of you, but I think it's fascinating. Yeah.
Let's go back to the footnote which Jeffrey quoted on page 216.
Yes.
This consciousness has no relation to our consciousness. I always get stuck with this because it seems to me that this consciousness is the basic fundamental source of our consciousness. Is it not?
Yes. But the consciousness of the one manifested, if not absolute, is still unconditional. And so, yes, so it's the consciousness of the one manifested with which we do have relation, even though that's still unconditional. But of the consciousness which we cannot even conceive, I suppose, is the unspeakable, the unnameable, and yet it must be if there is to be any consciousness.
Well, in one aspect, it's an undifferentiated consciousness. It's undivided.
Yes.
It's generic consciousness, so to speak, from which our unitary consciousness seems to come. What difference there is in quality they don't know. I don't know in what sense this is said here. But I became mindful of that note by reason of what you said about the consciousness of the king.
Yes.
I don't know what it was, but it evoked this remembrance.
Well, the consciousness of the king in this, at one point, it remains, it stays, and the only access to it is through the inner and outer functionaries.
Oh yes, well that's what made me say it isn't as our consciousness, but that of the functionaries may be.
Maybe, yes, that's right.
The only way to
That's
it
the
is
only
via
way.
them.
That's right, yes.
I don't know if anyone here has experienced it, but it's very good sometimes to try to feel this in the Tibetan mode. As when we are taught in Tibetan meditation frequently to be the king in meditation, to sit in a regal posture, feeling this. And okay, all these functionaries are coming in and out of the central palace. As a thought comes in, yes, certainly, let it pass out, having given its message. As a feeling comes in, as a swell, as a sound, but let them go again. The king doesn't go rushing out after the gate after his emissaries. The king remains in his regal position.
That's right. The king
And gradually learning to feel out this going on in what goes on. Not saying, oh no, I mustn't think, I must be a void or whatever, but allowing it to come as an underling.
That's right.
Staying in the regal central position. One can only try it out even more than seeing it in this kind of way.
Yes, I was looking at the summary at the end of volume 1, where again she speaks of consciousness, and I was looking, but I can't see where she says we make the mistake of turning it into a personal instead of a generic term. Paragraph 5 of the numbered paragraphs right at the end.
Page?
Well, it's 274, but it's the recapitulation at the end very near the end of volume 1, whichever one you're using. So part 1, volume 1, or volume 1 of the Adya edition, round about 317 or soon after that. Maybe 300, something like that. The numbered paragraph 5, and of course it is in the Foundations of Esoteric Philosophy, where they are connected together. Paragraph 5, everything in the universe throughout all the kingdoms is conscious, endowed with consciousness of its own kind and on its own plane of perception. We men must remember that, because we do not perceive any signs, which we have recognized, of consciousness, say in stones, we have no right to say that no consciousness exists there. Because where she uses the term generic, goes on the rock.
There is a place, you're right,
that
where she uses it.
Again, at the end of the paragraph, a couple of pages later on, in sober truth, the paragraph it begins with in sober truth, as just shown, and so on. She goes on to say, the first differentiation of its reflection towards the end of that paragraph, in a manifested world is purely spiritual, and the beings generated in it are not endowed with a consciousness that has any relation to the one we conceive of. They
That
can have
doesn't
no
mean it doesn't
human
have,
consciousness.
yes, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have a relation to our consciousness, but only to the to any that we can conceive of,
Yes,
because it's a
indeed.
different order
Indeed,
completely.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
The next sentence.
The next sentence, yes, I think I interrupted you, Yanthi. Go ahead.
No. It's the point that we tend to turn everything back into what we
can
have
do.
experienced.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's right.
How
They
we
can have
use
no
the
human
term.
consciousness before they have acquired such, personally and individually,
To the dual process.
gone through the dual process.
But I think if we shield up all the human consciences during the Manvantara, the entire Manvantara, it's already entirely different consciences that we have to deal with.
Oh, yes.
So that consciousness that we don't know anything about is the totality of so many Manvantara that had been evolving. And naturally, remember that when a certain stage of our vibration living, what we connect with is the Mahatma, that is a mind, that for me, at least, for me, a mind vibration is entirely different from the conscience, the unique conscience, because it's already involved in matter.
Yeah. I call your attention to, because I had this in my notes but did not quote it, but I've been saying it in effect to the statement about the middle of page 276, which I think is substantially what I have been saying. Man, as shown in volume 2, being a compound of the essences of all those celestial hierarchies, may succeed in making himself as such superior in one sense to any hierarchy or class or even combination of them. This is, of course, a task that is, in one sense, before us, a dharma, a responsibility.
Yes, and then the whole rationale of spiritual development in the next 2 or 3 sentences.
Yes.
By parallelizing.
It's lower personality. Go ahead, Jeffrey.
And arriving thereby at the full knowledge of the non-separateness underlying of his higher self from the one absolute self, man can, even during his terrestrial life, become as one of us.
It's a marvelous, amazing statement. And this is, you see, I think, again, this is why I get excited over this Tibetan text, because it really is. Now, to what extent, for example, the Mahatmas who were HPP's teachers were aware of just such texts as this. As I've said before, while we can find the parallels in so many other areas, they were immersed in the Trans-Himalayan teachings. They were indeed, again and again, I say this, we are Buddhists now.
Could we read the rest of this,
Yeah.
which is
What
very
page?
exciting. This is the 276, the middle paragraph at the end. Thus it is, by eating of the fruit of knowledge which dispels ignorance, that man becomes like one of the Elohim, or the Dhyanis, and once on their plane,
That's the plane of the Dhyanis or the Elohim.
the spirit of solidarity and perfect harmony, which reigns in every hierarchy, must extend over him and protect him in every particular.
That's why you see in this Tibetan text, the palace guards are seen not simply as barring the gate, and incidentally, there are female palace guards, not only male, because throughout the system they're both. And it's the female ones that present the fiercest faces, incidentally, who really are the fierce is really the tranquil ones are the male ones, the fierce ones are the female ones. But they not only guard it, but they protect, you see. And that's precisely what she's saying here. In every particular.
Reminded of Kipling.